this is Joan Fernley, your French diction coach for choirs. And this video is part 2 of À la claire fontaine. Now, if you're looking for a coaching session, that was part 1, and I've put the link down below and you can watch that video. In part 1, I mentioned that you will inevitably come across different lyrics depending on the arrangement you might be singing. And this is completely normal. It's not a mistake. It's typical of oral traditions. But in this case, it actually goes a bit deeper. À la claire fontaine has a fascinating story. It's central to French Canadian culture, and understanding that story will give you a better understanding of these text differences that simply can't be explained away by the normal passing on of oral traditions. So these text variations are better understood from 2 perspectives, and this is where things get interesting. So in the first part of this video, we will explore the origins of the song, and in the second part, we'll talk about its connection to a rebellion in 1837 and 1838. And in both parts of these videos, I will weave the commentary about the text variations that stem from these 2 perspectives. And finally, in the third part of the video, I will touch on the various ways that this song would have been sung. So where does À la claire fontaine come from? Well, just like many French Canadian folk songs, it finds its roots in France. And many folk songs simply came from France and were sung by the French settlers and eventually wove their way into the fabric of French Canada. However, À la claire fontaine is not simply a French import. And rather, you could think of it more as an offshoot of a French song from France that was transformed to the extent that you could consider À la claire fontaine to be an original French Canadian folk song. So the original song is called En revenant des noces, which means coming back from a wedding. And this song also has its own set of text variations. In fact, a late 19th century linguist wrote a whole article about it in 1883. And yes, you will find the link to that article below if you are so inclined. And just by poking around YouTube, I came across a couple of tunes for this song, none of which are the same as À la claire fontaine. The tune itself is an original tune from French Canada. Just to keep things simple, I will read the text that I found on the Wikipedia page, and you can follow along and see where you find the text similarities between En revenant des noces and À la claire fontaine. En revenant de noces, j'étais bien fatiguée. Au bord d'une fontaine, je me suis reposée. Et l'eau était si claire que je m'y suis baignée. À la feuille du chêne, je me suis essuyée. Sur la plus haute branche, le rossignol chantait. Chante, rossignol, chante, toi qui as le cœur gai. Le mien n'est pas de même, il est bien affligé. C'est de mon ami Pierre qui ne veut plus m'aimer, pour un bouton de rose que j'ai trop tôt donné. Je voudrais que la rose fût encore au rosier, et que mon ami Pierre fût encore à m'aimer. The first difference that caught my attention when I first came across this version of the song is the narrator's gender. So in the original En revenant des noces, it is clearly a woman that is speaking because she names her lover Pierre, Peter. And there's also a number of silent E's in the grammar that also indicate the feminine. But in À la claire fontaine, it's flipped. It's a man speaking. And we know this because in one version of the lyrics, he refers to his maîtresse. And in another version, he speaks of his amie, with an E at the end. And in both cases, that indicates a female love interest. So here on the screen are the 2 sets of very common textual variations. So on the one hand, you will have the one version that uses the word maîtresse, and the other one, it will use amie. And because I'm the French diction coach, I will read both versions. J'ai perdu ma maîtresse sans l'avoir méritée, pour un bouquet de roses que je lui refusai. Je voudrais que la rose fût encore au rosier, et moi et ma maîtresse dans les mêmes amitiés. And the second version with ami, j'ai perdu mon amie sans l'avoir méritée, pour un bouquet de roses que je lui refusai. Je voudrais que la rose fût encore au rosier, et que ma douce amie fût encore à m'aimer. So you'll notice that when I speak the word ami, I don't pronounce the E at the end, but when I sing it, and when I speak it the way I would sing it, I add the E sound, amie. And that's just very common 19th century and so on to pronounce the E at the end of ami when you're singing it. So in both cases, we're talking about a female love interest in À la claire fontaine. And just to note that the direct translation of maîtresse is mistress, but here the meaning is much more respectable. It doesn't refer to any kind of illicit affairs. Also, in today's world, ami often translates more as friend, but at that time it would have translated as a love interest. So songs usually pick one set of verses, either the maîtresse version or the amie version. But interestingly, in part one of the video, I read the Larry Nickel choral arrangement, the lyrics that he chose, and he actually begins with the maîtresse verse, and he ends with the amie verse. And again, this is just an example that there are no right or wrong ways of doing this, because it's an oral tradition and it just depends the version that, which version he ended up getting. Now, the second difference that I find fascinating is the whole story around the bouquet of roses. So in the original, it's not a bouquet. In the original, the woman says that Pierre has left her pour un bouton de rose que j'ai trop tôt donné. Literally, that means that he left her because of a rosebud that she gave away too soon. So what does this mean? To whom is she giving this rosebud, and why is it too soon? Well, of course, this is a metaphor. Some would say that this is a metaphor for sex. This is a metaphor for even her virginity. So in other words, it's a fallen woman who has given herself too soon, and presumably not to Pierre. So it's a cautionary tale from a woman's perspective. She gave herself too soon, she paid the price, and she lost the love of her life. Now compare that to À la claire fontaine. So in the original, we have a rosebud that she gave away too soon. But in À la claire fontaine, when it's a man speaking, he's saying, j'ai perdu ma maîtresse or amie sans l'avoir méritée pour un bouquet de roses que je lui refusai. So this means I unfairly lost my love because of a bouquet of roses that I refused. And it's a little awkward. It doesn't make much sense in the context of a man speaking, because the typical scenario would be that a man offers flowers or metaphorically makes sexual advances, and the woman accepts or refuses. So it doesn't really make sense that the man would refuse. He may refuse to offer a bouquet of roses, but again, he either refuses the bouquet or he refuses to offer a bouquet. And perhaps that's how many would have interpreted it, because you're just implying that the man isn't properly showing his love. Perhaps. And in fact, that's what I used to think when I was young, that the man just refused to buy the girl flowers and she dumped him. So as much as we clearly have a man speaking, you might think also that these lyrics suggest that we still have a connection to the earlier version that was told from the woman's perspective and not the man's perspective. Who knows? So all this talk of roses leads me straight into part 2. Now, what about this connection to a rebellion? Well, in the 19th century, À la Clairefontaine was a quasi-national anthem for French Canadians. And as a French Canadian myself, I did not know this until very, very recently when I was researching this song. But I do know what it's connected to. And it's connected to an uprising of les patriotes, which literally means the patriots. And that was in 1837 and 1838. And it's basically an uprising of French Canadians, who are the patriotes, against British rule. So again, what does this have to do with À la Clairefontaine? Well, it's all related to the verses that talk about the rose. And the rose is the emblem of England. And so using this song as a patriotic anthem, basically the French Canadians are saying that we wish that the rose had remained on the rose bush, which means we wish the English were back in their country and would leave the French Canadians alone to mind their own business. Some of you might think, well, that's a bit of a stretch. Well, I didn't make it up. I found this information. But there's also a very interesting textual variation that has pretty much been forgotten today. We don't see it commonly. It was new to me. I'm putting it up on the screen. So we have the original verse in blue. Je voudrais que la rose fût encore au rosier, et moi et ma maîtresse dans les mêmes amitiés, or amis. But the textual variation is Je voudrais que la rose fût encore au rosier, et que le rosier même fût à la mer jeté. So these last two lines highlighted in red are saying, not only do we want the rose to be back on the rose bush, we want the whole rose bush to be thrown into the ocean. So I don't know, to me that seals the deal. That really does indicate that we really want the English out of French Canada. So as a bonus, there are a couple of text variations that are worth mentioning, particularly one concerning the refrain. So in part 1, I read Il y a longtemps que je t'aime, and so on. And that's the way I learned it growing up. The other version is Lui y a longtemps que je t'aime. It's very common. There's no right or wrong. You'll find both versions quite commonly. And it just so happens that Lui y a longtemps is the version that Stephen Smith has included in his arrangement on cypresschoral.com. Now, the second variation is a bit more of a curiosity. You're not going to find this text in versions of À la Clairefontaine. It's more related to En revenant de noces. But for me, it sheds light on a bit of a mystery, because I mentioned in part 1 that the second and fourth line, which are the end of each musical phrase, end in the sound et, with one exception, which is the word chanter. Un rossignol chantait, not un rossignol chanté. And the French linguist from the 19th century in his article notes two differences that end in et. So one of them is sur la plus haute branche, rossignol a chanté. And the other variation is j'ai entendu la voix du rossignol chanter. So I just find it interesting that here we have a rhyme that ends in et, and the whole song rhymes perfectly, but somewhere along the way we dropped that. And perhaps it's simply because it was just easier to sing Un rossignol chantait. It just seemed perhaps more natural to people passing on that song, or maybe, who knows why. But we have Un rossignol chantait, so we have that exception that doesn't rhyme with the rest of the song. So how was À la Clairefontaine sung before we started singing it in concert and had choral arrangements? Because choral arrangements will basically take a verse and then a refrain and then the verse, and the only thing that really gets repeated is the refrain itself. But in fact, that's not how the folk songs, French Canadian folk songs, were sung typically. And in fact, they built in a lot more repetition into the song, which makes a lot of sense, because if you're trying to pass on an oral tradition, or if you're trying to get a bunch of people in a room to sing along with you, you need to guide everyone and to teach the song. And so you would build in a lot of textual repetition so that people could eventually catch on to the song. So there's basically two patterns. The first pattern is the pattern that is much more familiar to me. And so in this pattern, you would sing the first musical phrase, which is à la claire fontaine m'en allant promener. And then you would sing j'ai trouvé l'eau si belle que je m'y suis baignée. So you see that second line, I've highlighted in red because that second line comes next. In the second verse, you repeat that line, j'ai trouvé l'eau si belle que je m'y suis baignée, and then you introduce the new line that I've highlighted in green, sur la plus haute branche, un rossignol chantait, and so on. So every second musical phrase becomes the first musical phrase of the next verse, and in effect, you've doubled all your verses. So it's one of the reasons we don't do this in choral concerts, because it would just go on forever. But pattern number one is really the probably the most common pattern that I'm aware of. But there is pattern two, which is also documented, and this has even more repetition. So you start with à la claire fontaine, and then everybody repeats it. You would have potentially a song leader that would start everyone off, and everyone repeats that line, and then you introduce the second musical phrase highlighted in red, j'ai trouvé l'eau si belle que je m'y suis baignée. But then you go to the second verse. The song leader may again get everyone started by singing j'ai trouvé l'eau si belle. Everyone responds j'ai trouvé l'eau si belle, and then we introduce the second line that I've noted in green, and so on. So it's even a longer song at this point, because instead of singing two musical phrases, you've actually built in a repetition of one of them. So it's three musical phrases. So that makes for an even longer song. But, you know, before the age of television and so on, you know, people would get together and they would sing songs, and it was fine to have a song that would go on for a while, or maybe you might learn this song while you were doing the dishes with your sister or your mother, or you would just learn these songs as part of life, because there were, you know, fewer distractions, and you filled in the time, and this built-in repetition would just make sure that these songs could be transmitted from generation to generation. Well, there you have it, the backstory of À la claire fontaine. I hope you learned a few things along the way. I know I certainly did. I grew up hearing this song, and there are things that I just learned just recently. So thank you so much for watching. Please share this video, and until next time, bye.